Pinkerton Audiobooks presents Spawn of Cthulhu, written by J. Pinkerton, featuring the voices of Jodie, Reynolds, and J. Pinkerton. Perhaps it was only fitting that we were to find the answer to the great asteroid dilemma on the planetoid named after the famous Howard Phillips Lovecraft. I refer to the tiny worldlet called Lovecraftia, planetoid 946 on your star charts. We landed on Lovecraftia on the 17th day of the 20th month of our expedition, or to be prosaic, on the 2nd of July, 3042 AD. We were not the first interplanetary expedition attempting to resolve the issue of what the asteroids were and where they had come from. We were perhaps the 12th, and we weren't any better equipped than the others had been, merely more persistent and perhaps luckier. We had been directed by the University of Lunar City, located on Earth's moon, to go out there and bring home the bacon, and we were determined to do so. By we, I mean the three of us. Chance Bergstrom, that's me. Astrogator, marksman, and engineer. Jebediah Matheson, co-astrogator and cosmologist. And Desia Wilkinson, of course. A gorgeous sight in any clime, and a pleasure in deepest space. Desia was our archaeologist. We'd had wonderful luck. Early in the game, we had located a nearly perfect cave ruin in one of the more obscure planetoid fragments. It was, unlike other planetoid ruins, almost intact, probably because the planet fragment was a huge chunk of metal. A lead mine once, we presumed. In the honeycombed interior of this nugget of lead, we had found a metal map, which was to lead us, months later, to Lovecraftia and adventure. You know something of the great asteroid dilemma, I am sure. Every 31st century schoolchild knows it well. How, sometime, several million years ago, between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter, there used to be a planet known as Phaeton that was about the size of Earth, and how something had happened to it. Something had shattered it to bits, blown the whole planet to shards that now moved about the sun on their own as several thousand tiny planetoids. Little moonlets and worldlets, ranging from 1 to 100 miles in diameter, but fragments nonetheless, mere fragments of a greater world that had vanished. The question that our leaders pondered was, why? It may have been a hydrogen bomb chain reaction due to some type of final warfare. If so, who were the combatants, and why? We know very little of that lost planet's ancient inhabitants. How could we, when their very world itself was blown apart in their folly? Or was it folly? Could there have been some race of entities there so evil that someone tried to destroy them? Now, all that remains of Phaeton are a few bits of carved rock, some twisted metal, a fragmented shard embedded tortuously in some tiny worldlet's raw and torn surface. That is all. Mighty cities, huge monuments, great constructions, all would have been pulverized had they existed, shredded, crushed, blown to a powder. From the few pitiful fragments, all we could do was merely assume that there had once been such a civilization. We did not even know what they may have looked like, whether they were men or insects or some strange sort of monsters. So little was left. Yet, on that nameless hunk of cosmic debris, we had found, intact, a sort of map, and on that metal pillar was engraved the depiction of a place where a bomb-proof, shatterproof cavern world had been built. A place where that civilization's rulers could ride out even a planetary disaster. It had taken us months to decipher those directions, and months more to locate this small world, which was several dozen miles in diameter. It was on this planetoid, Lovecraftia, that we now landed. The worldlet was tiny, barren, and airless, as such worldlets are. All about our ship lay a cold scenery of torn and scarred rock beneath a black and pitiless sky. Desia and I put on our helmets, gathered our research packs and borers, our hand blasters, and our tridimensional photoscopes, and finally emerged from our scouting vessel. "No sign of life," I said over our helmet squawkers.
"Naturally not,"
Desia responded.
"You didn't really expect to find signs of life on the outside of this planet, did you? If the map is correct, This entire world is hollow.
I said, but would there be an opening? Desia's beautiful brows wrinkled in a frown of thought. We surveyed the dreary landscape, but to no avail. Our weight was very light, only a few pounds due to the low gravity of this worldlet, and we made progress by huge leaps and bounds. We came to the top of a hill, and Desia stopped and pointed. On the other side of the hill was a huge depression in the ground, and at the bottom, a coil of white vapor was spouting upward. We held hands and vaulted toward it as one. Once we had gained the lip of the depression, we knew we had found what the entire earth had been seeking, for here below us was a huge metal door, a door dozens of yards across, fixed into the bottom of the huge crater-like depression, and the spout of vapor was some kind of exhaust valve for whatever was within. I called Jebediah on my helmet squawker, and he, who had remained in the ship, glided it over to where we were. Desia and I took a hand disintegrator from the ship and blasted the ray into the metal door that was set into the planet's surface. The great beam of white ionic force bit into the metal and began to bore through it. A shower of sparks and streams of radiant vapor poured forth as the disintegrator made an opening. Desia and I lowered ourselves into the dark tunnel that led to the core of this planetoid. Downward we fell weightlessly into the terrible interior of that forsaken planetoid. At last, we found ourselves in a blue-lit cavern, a cavern miles across that was lit with a strange phosphorescent radiance. As we stood on the inner surface of that tiny world, we could see constructions that spanned the weightless interior. The constructions looked like giant spiderwebs that seemed to be composed of delicate metallic girders, and coming down these metal webs toward us were the inhabitants, the last descendants of the lost planet known as Phaeton. I cannot describe accurately the unnameable horrors that we saw sliding down those metal webs toward us. I can only say that if you imagine all of your worst nightmares, you will have some idea of what they looked like. A group of beings racing toward us, uttering terrible guttural noises and making strange articulations that sounded like a ghastly parody of bestial communication. Their bodies were humanoid, with octopus-like heads, and faces that were a mass of tentacles. Long, narrow wings trailed behind them as they scurried those metallic webs. In their dark, ghastly eyes reflected all of the unholy and vile things that sleep beneath the earth's crust, and in the hidden cities beneath the sea, those unhallowed things that lie in wait, hidden from the light of day in the forbidden darkness of subterranean and primordial caverns. The monstrous guttural creatures were coming at us from all directions. I yelled to Desia over the helmet squawker and started back. Desia tried to run, but stumbled and smashed her helmet. I turned back, took the broken helmet from her head, and helped her to her feet. By that time, the creatures were almost upon us. I pulled my hand blaster and fired. The red beam lanced out and sizzled into the head of the one nearest us. It fell to the floor convulsing and shrieking terribly as it burned before our eyes. Desia and I managed to blast a few more before the limited hand charges were exhausted. Then we were helpless. There were too many creatures for us to make it back to the crater. Jebediah came to the rescue. He had heard our screams through the helmet squawkers, and though he didn't know what was happening, he had started the ship, bored a larger hole through the surface door, and plunged the ship through. He landed the ship beside us, and Desia and I scrambled to the bulkhead hatch. As I turned to pull her in with me, I saw that one of the creatures had grabbed her. I drew my hand blaster and started to fire, but I remembered that the weapon was exhausted. In an act of desperation, I hurled the empty weapon at the creature's horrible face. To my amazement, the monstrous face exploded when the empty hand blaster hit it. Desia, now freed, scrambled into the ship. We slammed the hatch, and Jebediah sped off down the tunnel toward the exit. Afterward, we decided that these descendants of a once mighty but inhuman race must have devolved in the course of the lost centuries. They had once again become mere ravening beasts and had lost their intelligence in the endless years following the destruction of their world, and because of the weightlessness of their tiny hideout, the planetoid Lovecraftia, their skeletons had become so fragile, so weak, so light, that the mere blow of a solid metal object had enough power to utterly shatter them. They were the offspring of Cthulhu, rulers of a lost planet. They had been kings once, but the elder things who were at war with Cthulhu and his relatives had destroyed their world before pursuing Cthulhu to Earth, and finally, the spawn of Cthulhu had lost even the dignity of a solid body. The end.
Please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel and click the bell to be notified when we post new videos.